Good morning. Good morning. Let us pray. Father, we give thanks to you for this day, and we praise you for who you are, and thank you for all of your blessings. Thank you for the opportunity to serve one another and to serve you. We pray now continued blessings upon our chamber. We pray for our nation. We pray for the world. We pray especially for this community. We pray that the meeting today will be fruitful and productive, and we all will be better for it. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Have a new addition here, which unfortunately I've reached that point. So it's definitely a new time. So want to thank everybody for being here. Really excited. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Charles Wood. I'm CEO of the Chattanooga Area Chamber of Commerce. I'm an economic developer at heart, and so really, even though our annual open house in December is a lot of fun, this is probably one of the events I really look forward to the most, so appreciate everybody being here. I want to thank our sponsors first and foremost. So our presenting sponsors, Bank of America and Chattanooga Gas, really appreciate their partnership and their leadership, and certainly appreciate our past chair, Paul Leith, with Chattanooga Gas being here this morning. Our platinum sponsors are Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee and EPB. And our gold sponsors are the Chattanooga Airport, First Horizon Bank, Food City, Grandview, PNC Construction, Pinnacle Financial Partners, Opella, Truist, Unum, and Volkswagen Chattanooga. I'd also like to thank our food sponsor today, which is Be Caffeinated. So they've donated coffee and the goodies you got to eat earlier. So if you would, please join me in thanking all of our sponsors today for this great event. And then before I introduce Dr. Altig, I want to touch on a couple of things that the Chamber's been pretty involved with over the last few months. So we have had a couple of really big economic development projects that we were excited to see announced. We'll work through city and county processes, and the support for them will be critical. But if you had not seen, our friends at Novonix announced a little over $1 billion project back in January. That will create about 500 jobs out at Enterprise South. So really excited about the potential for that project. And then Westar Aviation also announced a 200 employee expansion out at the airport. I think today they're pushing 500 employees out there, and so really on their way to a pretty significant presence here in Chattanooga. So really excited to see Westar Aviation expand as well. And as we have those projects, this is where I'm going to use this platform a bit to remind you guys. We are able to compete for a lot of those projects, frankly, because our community, our city, and our county are very heavily focused on economic development. And for us, it's incredibly important that they continue to support that growth. A lot of what you see here today in Chattanooga has been an intentional effort, right, to change our economy. And so if you haven't noticed, there's a city election underway right now, and you'll hear from Mayor Kelly in a minute. So I really do want to encourage the folks that are here, don't take this lightly. There are a few city council races that are not contested, but certainly want to make sure that you guys are out voting. I will say this, no matter what, 4 of the 9 seats on city council will change. And so as we think about making sure we have folks that are on that council that are focused on economic growth for this community, and making sure that we live up to the legacy that was created as we recruited companies like Volkswagen to the community that really changed the economic trajectory of Chattanooga. The folks that sit in those seats are incredibly important. So I want to encourage you guys to vote. Early voting's open now. Elections, I think, 4th of March officially, but you guys can go today. So for us, this is really important. We spend a lot of time on public policy and economic development. Those are 2 of our biggest focuses, and so hope that you will spend some time thinking about that and working towards that. And the last thing I want to say is I want to thank Chamber staff, if I could, and particularly Melissa Wallace, who runs all of our events. So thank her for that. And thanks, y'all. And if I could ask our Chamber board members or past board members to stand up really quickly, and if y'all could give them a round of applause as well. Thanks so much. And now I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. David Altig. Here again today, I will tell you I love having David here. He is fantastic and can make a lot of very technical economic jargon into things that a lot of folks understand and really can wrap their heads around. Dr. David Altig is Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He advises the Fed President in Atlanta on monetary policy and related matters while also overseeing the research division. Prior to joining the Atlanta Fed in 2007, Dr. Altig served as Vice President and Associate Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. Please join me in welcoming David Altig to the stage.
Morning. It's great to be back in Chattanooga. I always enjoy it. I don't know that if you're all aware of this, but Chattanooga has been one of the cities that was one of the inaugural communities in something we called the Southern Cities Economic Inclusion Initiative. So I want to give a shout out to Mayor Kelly and the team for being great partners in that with us. And congratulate them for the good work they did in that program. For some reason, I always love to come to Tennessee, and for some reason I found myself in Tennessee a lot at the end of last year. It just happened. So I was in Nashville in one of those visits, and I took an Uber from the airport. That's kind of what you do. And got into my Uber driver was a very chatty guy. It's really not my favorite trait in an Uber driver. I like two things: don't drive like a maniac and silence. Those are my. But he was entertaining enough. He was one of those fellows that had come to Nashville seeking his fame and fortune from some small town in the Midwest, kind of town where you marry the first girl you're not related to, and he was charming. He was wanted to be a songwriter. And at one point during the trip, he says to me, "Hey, would you like to hear a riddle?" I said, "Sure." So he goes, "Okay, here it is. Brothers and sisters, I have none, but this man's father is my father's son. Who is it?" I said, "I don't know. Who is it?" He goes, "It's me." I said, "This man's father, my father. Oh, I got it. That's a good one. I'm going to remember it." So the minute I went home, I went run into my wife and said, "Hey, you want to hear a riddle?" Now, I started dating my wife in 1972. I'm not sure how many years ago that was exactly, but it's long enough that she looked at me with that air of resignation and said, "It doesn't matter what I say, you're going to tell me anyway, aren't you?" And I go, "Yeah." So here it is. Brothers and sisters, I have none, but this man's father is my father's son. Who is it? She goes, "I don't know. Who is it?" I said, "It's some Uber driver in Nashville." So I'm not all that great at riddles, but the thing about a riddle is if it's well constructed, all the pieces are there for you to figure out what the answer is. And most of the time in this job that I have, that's kind of what it's like. The economy is a riddle, but all the pieces are there, and all we got to do is sort of work a little bit to kind of get really what the fundamental answer is to all the things we're trying to find out. That is not where we are now. The economy right now is not like a riddle. It's like a puzzle with pieces missing. And those pieces missing means that we really can't get anything like a good picture, even if we're pretty good puzzle put-togetherers. So it's an economic outlook. I'm not going to give you one. These days, I'm refusing. I'm not going to give a forecast. I've been wrong every year I've come here, by the way. It's kind of a string now. I always look back at last year's presentation to see how I did. I don't like doing that. But this year, it's almost a senseless exercise. So if you tied me to a chair and poked me with cattle prods, here's what I would tell you. I would tell you 2025 is likely to be like 2024, only a little bit less. A little bit less growth, a little less employment, a little less inflation. Not a lot, a little. But I have zero confidence in all that. So I'm not going to tell you any story that would try to justify what that outlook looks like. I'm going to go through the list of all the missing pieces that we know are missing in one fashion or another. So here's all of the known unknowns. Productivity, fiscal policy, immigration, tariffs, inflation. Inflation, maybe we know a little bit more about, but I'm going to convince you maybe that's not so either. Or at least I'm going to say it, may not convince you. So just kind of tick through the things that we think we need to know or discover before we can begin to accurately put together a picture of where this economy is really truly headed. And I'm going to start with the good news, or at least potentially good news, and that's this productivity missing piece. Here's a picture of productivity in the US economy going back to 2012. It's literally how much production you get out of every hour worked in the United States as a total. The blue line is the actual productivity number, and that orange line there is the trend of productivity between the global financial crisis and the pandemic. And the very obvious thing from this picture is, with the pandemic, there was a large jump, an increase in productivity that has not reversed. And in fact, if you look over the past couple years, it looks like maybe productivity growth is accelerating. Now, why is this great news? Well, it's great news because, look, if you want to actually forecast GDP in the US economy, it's pretty simple. I've probably said this a million times. You take how fast the labor supply is growing, you add to it how fast labor productivity is growing, there you go. That's it. And conceptually, it's as simple as can be. So this productivity piece is absolutely essential to where we're headed with growth in the economy. And you could look at this picture and say we are on a track now which puts us in a much higher growth, a higher growth trajectory than was true prior to the pandemic. So getting to the bottom of this picture is really sort of and all good things. Look, there's nothing better than productivity growth. You get more output, you get more higher wages, you get lower inflation, all else equal. You get nothing but good stuff. So are we on the cusp or in the beginning phases of lots of good stuff? Well, it kind of depends what the interpretation of this picture is. So I'm going to give you three interpretations. One is, do want to tell you that jump in productivity you see around the time of the pandemic, that happens in almost every recession. Every time there's a downturn in the economy, productivity jumps. Why? Because necessity is the mother of innovation. Typically in a recession, it's because you're trying to shrink down your labor force, you're shedding jobs, you're trying to keep your business going, and so you have to get more efficient, and businesses do. And also, some of the weaker businesses sort of go away, and the higher productivity businesses stay around. So that jump sort of always happens. Now, that was kind of a big one. And the cause of it was a little different this time around, because it wasn't because we were trying to shed labor. At that time, it was because we couldn't get labor. I was reminded that I told the story of going to church a couple years ago, and the punchline was, not even Jesus can get good help these days. And that was the situation we were in at that time. But still, it was necessity to keep things going. You had to do more with fewer workers than were ideal. All right, so that's a good story, but it really is a one-time story. It sort of happens during a period of stress. One of the things I would argue is that labor markets are no longer tight like they were back in those days. The recession and the pandemic reshuffling is sort of over. So that just means, okay, we got a nice couple of years, but if you're looking forward and thinking about how fast the economy can grow from here, this isn't a story that gives you the answer, we can grow faster. Okay. There's a second possible story that is embedded in this picture. This is a picture of, well, the title says, high propensity business applications. What that is it's basically new business formation or applications for new business formation among firms that are likely to create jobs. That's what the high propensity part means. This is from the Census Bureau. So it's corporations and it's non-corporate entities that have indicated an intention to create payrolls when they go into operation. And it turns out this does predict new business formation in reality. So you can see what happened at the pandemic. There was a big jump and a jump that has not reversed. If you want to know where Tennessee sits on that, what it looks like, there's the South. That includes Texas and Florida and the Carolinas, of course. If you look at any region in the country, almost any state in the country, you see the same thing. Post-pandemic, there's this big jump in this high propensity business application series. Now, why that's important is because one of the things we know is that disproportionately, new businesses are the ones on the frontier of new technologies. I mean, for obvious reasons. They got a blank slate, they can pull in the latest and greatest, and they do. So this is sort of a middle case. If this is actually a symptom, a signal of newfound dynamism in the US economy, then A, it helps explain why we jump to a higher level of productivity potentially, and B, opens up the possibility, if this continues on, that the growth rate of productivity is going to expand as well. Could go either way on that story. There's yet a third story. And the third story has to do with this picture. This picture is a chart that includes patents on AI-related technologies going back to the 1990s, but what you obviously see is around the time of the millennium, there is an acceleration. That shaded area, there was a major patent reform at the time, and across the board, patents sort of exploded, but this is specifically those things that we've identified as sort of AI-related technologies. Now, that date, 2000, where this all begins, is really important. And it's really important for the following reason. The last major technological revolution, the information and communication technology revolution, took about 25 years to gestate. Took about 25 years from the time, personal computers really come online as a commercially viable product, and until we saw the acceleration of productivity associated with that set of technologies, which happened in about the late 1990s, latter half of the 1990s. The start was about mid-1970s, about the time I started dating my wife. So it was either my relationship that drove that, or this is the way technological revolutions work their way through the economy. In fact, there's a famous paper called 1974, and that paper was called 1974 because that's when they pinpoint the beginning of seeing information and communications technologies really take hold as an explanator of the productivity boom we saw in the late 1990s. And in fact, the paper looks back at other industrial revolutions, and that kind of timing seems pretty consistent. So if history at least rhymes, we're about 25 years in. And this is about the time that the promise of AI may be hitting, along with other technologies that are adjacent to it. We'll see, but if that's the case, this presumption that the speed limit on the economy is under 2% might fairly be called into question, and we might be lowballing really the prospects for the US economy going forward for some period of time. Now, I don't know, my experiments with AI, I showed you some last year, have not been fantastic. But that's okay. I have these long conversations with Claude and ChatGPT where I say, "Are you sure?" And it always comes back, "Nah, I'm not really so sure." But it's getting better every single day. By the way, these are ChatGPT generated graphics. So this one, I requested an image of an individual trying to guess what tax and spending policy is going to be. That's what it comes up. I don't know why it keeps coming up with all these steampunk-like graphics, but it does. So I gave you the good news on productivity. Now I'm going to talk about policy. So I'm going to talk about fiscal policy, I'm going to talk about immigration policy, I'm going to talk about tariffs. I'm going to sort of talk about it. But before I do that, I want to say the following. If you think you hear me taking a position on what those policies will be, should be, whether they're good or bad, you are mistaken. I am not, I've got my Fed hat on solidly. We're staying out of this business. I'm only saying I'm in the same boat as all of you, which is we're going to have it happen to us. And then we're going to have to figure out what it means and how we deal with it. And the views that I express are not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System. All right, so fiscal policy. I'm going to show you one picture. This is federal fiscal policy. This is from the Congressional Budget Office. This is from their January report, so this is hot off the presses. It's the projections of deficits relative to GDP over the next 10 years. That's the red line. And debt relative to GDP over the next 10 years. That's the green bars. So rather than just stare at that, I'll tell you what the CBO has to say about all of this. Number one, in their projections, total deficits equal or exceed 5.5% of GDP in every year but one for the next 10 years. Since 1930, deficits have not remained that large for more than 5 years in a row. Since 1940, net outlays for interest have never exceeded 3.2% of GDP. According to the Congressional Budget Office, such outlays will exceed that percentage in every year for the next 10 years, from 2027 to 2035. Debt held by the public rises each year from 2025 to 2035. It swells from 100% of GDP to 118% by the end of the projection period, an amount greater than at any point in the nation's history. All of which to say this is uncharted territory. And what it means to be uncharted territory is you're in uncharted territory. You don't kind of know which way this is all going to go. Now, I should point out, we were in uncharted territory after the global financial crisis, when debt relative to GDP rose from about 35% to basically now up to 90 eventually. So at that time, I know we were thinking, well, the bond vigilantes are coming out of the closet any day now. Interest rates are going to be extremely challenging, potentially, and that never happened. Now, I will say when looking at this set of facts from the CBO, there's one thing you should know, well, it's a couple things you should know, but one thing is, by law, the Congressional Budget Office comes up with these projections under the assumption of constant policy. Meaning they take the law as it is written and is supposed to play out at the time they make these projections. So these numbers assume that the tax cuts from 2017 are going to all expire. So everybody's tax rates are going up, the alternative minimum tax is coming back, accelerated depreciation is going to go away. All that stuff happens in these numbers. So the numbers move north if that does not happen. Now, to be fair, it also doesn't incorporate anything that might be coming out of the DOGE efforts or whatever else might happen out of Congress. It's hard to say. But it's back to the theme of this talk, trying to figure out how this is all going to play out seems almost foolish, given that it's unlikely that the CBO is not going to have to recast this entire picture within a couple months, if not somewhat longer. All right, there's another sort of element to this that is makes it sort of uncertain, more uncertain than usual. And interestingly, it has to do with immigration. So also embedded in those numbers from the Congressional Budget Office is the assumption that the immigration influx over 2022, 23, 24, which amounted to 8 to 10 million extra workers in the US economy. Those folks will still be around, at least over the next several years. And from the point of view of the federal government, that's a revenue positive. So at the federal level, immigration, which includes both kind of regular authorized immigration, which would be people with visas and green cards, but also includes unauthorized immigration, which does include people who, for instance, came, filed for asylum, were given court dates to have their cases adjudicated, and then were given work permits. It includes all those people. And from the point of view of the federal government, they collect more in revenues from that group of individuals than they spend on various sorts of government spending programs. That's actually not true at the state and local level. It reverses. At the state and local level, the immigration requires more outlays than you typically get in revenue, so it kind of flips the situation between the federal government and the state government, but this was all about the federal government. Because obviously localities need to think about that issue as well. But I bring that up in part simply to indicate that in addition to assuming tax cuts go away, in addition to assuming interest rates on 10-year treasuries remain at about 4% and not higher, it also assumes that the extra revenues from immigration, which turned out to be fairly large because that was a large number of people, that's going to stick around too. And there won't be changes in immigration policy that removes a whole set of people who are taxpayers. The other part, so it makes the policy stuff a little bit hard to figure out. The other thing it makes hard to figure out is what's going on in labor markets. So the last couple years, you've seen me show up on this stage or stage like it and scratch my head about, we cannot figure out exactly how the U.S. economy can create so many jobs, how the labor market can be so hot and yet not see outsized wage pressures, which are contributing to difficulty sort of managing the inflation picture. Right after we talked last year, in February, the CBO, again, the Congressional Budget Office, released this picture that really sort of answered the question. This is one of those riddles where we were able to sort of figure it out. This is a picture of population growth, so just think of that as a proxy for labor supply. And you can see what happened post-pandemic. Just a huge spike in population growth in the US. Now, unless something was going on with your kids that I don't know about, or the CBO doesn't know about, we know where that came from. It came from the light shaded green part, that's immigration. So when we were scratching our heads trying to figure out, well, how is it like in 2023 you could create over 200,000 jobs a month, well over 200,000 jobs a month, and not see any wage inflation? Even last year, even with the revisions that we've seen recently, 2024, we were we were like 140, 150,000 jobs a month created in the US economy on net, job gainers versus job losers. And if you ask me, how many jobs can the US economy create a month and not have serious issues with tightness in the labor market that you're going to have to kind of worry about, I would have given you a number like 75,000. So what was going on? Well, what was going on was this picture. Economics, real simple. I have probably said this before. I spent a whole bunch of time learning how to make it complicated. But for everybody else's purposes, go to Econ 101 the first day, listen to the lecture, and then leave. You don't need any more. Assuming that your instructor is teaching you demand and supply that day, you're good. Stick around for a couple other lessons. There's some cool stuff like comparative advantage and all that. But look, the first day, supply and demand, and this was just a simple supply and demand story. We had tons of labor demand, but it didn't create wage pressures because there was tons of labor supply that was sort of invisible at the time. And the simple economics, look, if demand is bigger than supply, prices go up. If supply is bigger than demand, prices go down, and if they're balancing, you're all good. And that's what was happening, kind of invisibly. Now, going forward, the issue, of course, is what's going to happen to this influx of individuals that were projected to sort of not leave until another several years by the CBO. And basically, they just looked out a couple of years and said, well, everything's going to kind of go back to normal. Well, I don't know. I don't know how much confidence we can have in what the full immigration picture is going to look like. And now we know it has impact on both revenues and for the federal government, but more importantly, it has consequences for the labor market and how that's going to play out. Now, it may play out just fine. Again, if supply and demand sort of go along together, everything's fine. And I already said, if you ask me what this year is going to look like relative to last year, a little bit less employment growth. So as we sort of settle into more normal employment patterns, maybe a shrinking labor force is exactly what we need because we don't then have to worry about having a bunch of surplus workers looking for jobs and the unemployment rate going up and all the complications that brings with it. But it's a question. If you want to know, and of course the kind of distribution of what the impact might be is going to depend on what sector you're in. So those are the 5 largest sectors, the 5 sectors that employ the largest number of immigration. This is the little old, it's from 2017, it's from Pew. But they actually do a really good job. I mean, they really do sort of the best analysis on this sort of thing that I know of. It's hard because you've got to guess the kind of lighter areas. So how much of it is the unauthorized workers are filling these jobs? So basically, you know, you get some of it from the census, you get some of it from Homeland Security, and you got to do a bunch of modeling, and it's a kind of hard job. And I think that they do it seriously. So take it for what it's worth, but you know, if you're in ag, construction, leisure, hospitality, manufacturing, this could be challenging. We just don't know yet. Did you get the theme? We just don't know. Tariffs. I'm going to say nothing. Not my business. But I do got a bunch of questions that really have to be answered. First of all, the first and most basic one is we don't even know what they're going to be yet. So you know, we don't even know what they are, how extensive they're going to be, how long they're going to last. We don't know any of that stuff. And then, more importantly, we for sure don't know what the reaction of the private sector is going to be. We don't know if firms will and can take it in profits. We don't know if they'll try to pass any price effects on to consumers. And we don't know if, when they try to pass it on to consumers, whether or not it'll stick and whether that's going to create a large demand problem. There's a lot of modeling done on this stuff, which basically goes back to the 2018-2019 period. Useless. Because those tariffs were imposed at a time when inflation had been low, stable, steady. Consumers were not unusually price sensitive at the time. That is not where we find ourselves today. So going back and trying to find the right analogy to whatever might happen here is going to be a very tough job. And it's almost going to happen by trial and error. Lots of trials, lots of errors. Which brings me to the last point. And so I hit my time mark. I won't belabor this, which I should because it's sort of my job. But we could maybe talk about it in the Q&A a little bit. But here's the point I want to make. So this is the Fed's gauge of inflation, consumer prices as measured by the PCE inflation index. I've shown you the headline number, that's orange, and the so-called core, subtracting out food and energy, which gives us a better picture of sort of where the trend is. And the only thing I want you to see is we made some progress last year. So the latest data we have on this statistic is from December. So I've kind of referenced where we were when we talked last year. And we've made some progress, but it's kind of flat. 3 possibilities there. One is the last mile is just always kind of stickier. It just takes a while for the last vestiges of a high inflationary period to get squeezed out. Another possibility, my favorite, the statistics are all janky. It's my boss's word. There's lots of technical things. We got a very not so nice CPI report for January. That will almost certainly feed over to some extent to this statistic. But Januaries have turned out to be really weird for several years running. COVID messed all of the seasonal adjustment stuff up. So maybe it's just, there's this weird stuff with housing. Relax, it's just a statistical anomaly. You should be throwing fruit at me. That is not so fresh. There's a third possibility, which is the problematic one, which is the current setting of monetary policy is not as tight as we think it is. And that's something for the policymakers to be thinking about going forward. Thinking about it going forward is our job. We'll do it. But of course, we got to answer all these other questions along with you. So I wish all of us good luck. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rusty Gray from Baker Donaldson, and I also have the privilege of serving as Vice Chair of the Economic Development at the Chamber. And I have a few questions for you, Dr. Altig. I'm not going to ask you any riddles like your Uber driver. But let's start with inflation, as you predicted we were going to here. So we've seen your chart where we've made progress. It does appear there have been some planing out. What do you see as the most significant forces that will determine inflation over the coming year?
Well, so I'm going to abstract from all those kind of bumps that we might face due to any of those other developments, because in the end, those won't really be about inflation. They'll be about price level adjustments that are not going to look good potentially. Maybe they will. Look, I don't want to prejudge whether or not things are going to develop in a way that helps us out. An obvious sort of one would be if we start to see kind of a relaxation of energy prices, for example. We know that we've got things like, bird flu messing up the price of eggs and all that sort of stuff. So you can get lucky and you can get some good luck. You can have some other policy or environmental things that go on that kind of give you some bad luck or push you in the other direction. But in the end, it's really whether or not monetary policy is appropriately calibrated to kind of, over time, move us towards that 2% target. I will not, venture an answer to that. You can listen to the members of the Federal Open Market Committee, what they're having to say, and they're all out talking. You know what they're saying, but that's the orientation that they consistently and forever maintain, which is we're trying to kind of make sure that policy is calibrated appropriately, which means where the interest rates are, to make sure that when we look at this picture next year, we're going to see something closer to 2%.
And let's build on that a little. So of course, with this inflation and some uncertainty there, we have seen, of course, a broadly stable labor market, no signs of serious deterioration, but there is considerable uncertainty with inflation, for instance. And what does that uncertainty mean for monetary policy in the coming months?
So the committee chose to pause in January, and if you sort of listen to the commentary afterwards and the chairman's press conference in particular, and and I always urge this. If you want to know exactly what all these folks are thinking, listen to that press conference. I've said this before, and you have no reason to believe me necessarily, but it is it's as transparent a communication as I have ever seen in my 35 years or so in the Fed. So they tell you exactly what you're thinking, and their thinking is, okay, right now, this is what the chairman said. Right now, we're in a pretty good place in that, those kind of features of the economy that you described. Labor market looks pretty good. Doesn't look overheated. Doesn't look like it's moving in a bad downward direction. We are making progress on inflation, although it's slower than we like to see. That all feels very good to us, and we think we've got policy where it needs to be at the moment to continue to see that picture I was up there last time move in the direction that the committee wants it to see. They will reevaluate basically every meeting to see if that is not as satisfying as a picture as they want it to, and they'll have to make a decision. You heard two governors out yesterday talking, and they, reiterated, look, we think we can make policy adjustments if we see the inflation behaving the way that is consistent with our objectives, and that's what we'll do. It's a very data-dependent world.
Building upon that evaluation of monetary policy and looking at how it's working, where do you and the Atlanta Fed research staff, what do you look at to see the effect or lack of effect on monetary policy?
Well, quite honestly, when I say, it's a data-dependent world, it really involves pulling apart the price statistics and looking at whether or not the underlying kind of fundamentals of what's happening seem to be consistent with inflation moving in one direction or another. So we're not doing at this point, here I am speaking for the Atlanta staff, we're not at this time doing a whole lot of model-based guessing about what's happening. The models aren't helping us much, quite frankly, going forward at the moment. And part of that is the disruption of COVID. Part of that is I'm not sure we ever actually caught up after the global financial crisis on the way kind of our statistical modeling and theoretical modeling was working. So, we look sort of pretty deeply at different cuts of the data. We look at, for example, I had a picture, I didn't show it for time purposes, but services subtracting out housing components. Chairman Powell at one point called this supercore. The idea being that this housing component of the price statistics is really kind of messed up. It's not behaving as it has in the past. It's a lot stickier than what it seems like it should be. So let's kind of put that aside and just ask, are all the other services in the economy, because the goods inflation has already returned to normal, service inflation has not, so what does that look like? So we look at that picture. Unfortunately, that picture is sort of stalled like the overall. In the past here, I've shown pictures of the share of prices that are rising at really high rates, over 5% or over 3%. That's normalized at the very high end, but not at the little bit above 2%. And so we just constantly cut the data and try to figure out whether or not we're being fooled by the overall statistics by a few unusual things like the price of eggs or something like that. My opinion is, my very personal opinion is, we're not being fooled. There's kind of, we've hit kind of a stall period, and we'll have to see if that persists. And that's what we'll be looking for.
You had a fascinating slide on productivity, which of course showed productivity in the workforce increasing and had that bump with the with COVID.
Yep.
But it continued to show the strong productivity growth.
Yep.
What is fueling that, and do you see it continuing?
Well, that was the million-dollar question. So we wrung our hands pretty consistently over the 20 years before the pandemic about the dynamism in the U.S. economy, which meant things like new job or new business creation. That appears to have kind of come back and accelerated. So it could be that. It really truly could be the promise of sort of the AI bucket of stuff is really at our doorstep, and it's going to show bear fruit soon. Everyone's sort of wondering whether the DeepSeek thing is like a real game changer or not. I can tell you that I heard from people who I trust, that it sort of is a game changer in the following sense, which is, so there are two elements of the DeepSeek thing. One is, you know, the advertisement that the initial development of the algorithms, the training cost, were very, very low. It doesn't seem like anybody believes that. However, the algorithms itself are open source, so anybody can look at them and sort of see what's going on. And they really did innovate and did something that made the application of the AI tool like cheaper by a factor of 10. And over time, the training costs are very small relative to the running cost, the application cost. So that means that this technology is going to be, it's more stable in the sense that it doesn't hallucinate as much, given the way that they sort of developed this. And it means that it's going to be accessible to a much broader swath of use cases and the economy. So, you know, it's what I heard. I don't know if it's actually true, but, you know, it's starting to feel, you know, despite my spending a couple years now kind of dumping on some of the weirder aspects of AI, it's starting to feel like there may be something real there, and that could be what we're about to see.
Something I've read a little bit about, and I don't think we've talked much about, is the Federal Open Market Committee. So the Federal Open Market Committee is starting a review of monetary policy strategy, tools, and communications. Can you tell us what the framework of that review entails and why the committee does it?
Yeah, so the framework itself is basically a statement about how the committee is thinking about its price stability mandate and how it's thinking about its maximum employment mandate in terms of, you know, how it's going to monitor and operate towards those objectives. So the first major framework review was in 2019. And that's the one where they sort of came up with a couple of key innovations. One was this idea of flexible average inflation targeting. That was a period where inflation had been below target for many, many years. So they said, well, we're willing to accept inflation a little bit above target for a while, so that over time we average 2%. There were technical reasons for that were described lately. We don't need to go into them, but we solved that problem of inflation being too low, by the way. You may have noticed. But that was, for that time, that was one of the innovations. And the other innovation was they expressed a reluctance to lean too hard against hot labor markets. They basically said, you know, in the old-fashioned way of thinking about things, if it looked like we were getting too many jobs, we wanted to pull back and put it more in line with some estimate of normal. That didn't seem like a good way to operate to them unless you were seeing inflation. So they basically said, if we're not seeing any inflation, we want more jobs, and we're willing to take as many jobs as we get. So those were sort of a couple of major changes at the time, and when they did that review, they committed, we're going to revisit this every 5 years in light of changing circumstances and see if those principles that we sort of laid out and that framework we laid out are still relevant. Or have we learned any lessons that we want to apply? And that's what the conversation is now. And obviously, things did not play out as was expected. COVID came, we got inflation we hadn't seen since the 70s. So a big part of that conversation is going to be, okay, now in light of what we may have learned over the last 5 years, is there something we want to change? And that's, they will not change the 2%. They've committed to kind of stay away from that. But they are going to think about all these other elements of their policy making.
Well, Dr. Altig, thank you again very much for being here. We certainly
here.
enjoyed it. Thanks so much. Tim Kelly is the 66th mayor of Chattanooga. He grew up in Chattanooga and attended undergraduate school at Columbia University. Upon return to Chattanooga, Mayor Kelly expanded his family's automotive dealership and launched several successful ventures. of his own, including co-founding Chattanooga's professional soccer club, CFC. Since being elected mayor in April of 2021, he's made great strides on his vision to create one Chattanooga, a city where every resident has the opportunity to thrive and prosper. Thanks for being here, Mayor Kelly, excuse me. Thank you. And then we also have Dr. Howard Wall. Dr. Wall is the director and chief economist of the Center for Regional Economic Research at UTC and a professor of practice in the Department of Finance and Economics. Previously, he served as 12 years as the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis as vice president and regional economics advisor. His research focused on applied econometrics and the intersection of macroeconomics and regional economics has been published in leading scholarly journals. Appreciate you both being here. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say on this local economy outlook. Here's where I want to start. Let's start with how the Chattanooga economy has evolved over the last 10 years. And I'd like to ask you kind of how our strengths in Chattanooga have compared to national trends. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Wall?
Yeah, thank you. So the Chattanooga economy really stands out from the rest of the country in that the resurgence, say, in the last 10, 12 years has been manufacturing driven. There's been a bit of a manufacturing renaissance nationwide, but in Chattanooga, it's much stronger. So something like 20% of job growth in 12 years or so has been in manufacturing directly. And that feeds off into other sectors also because people get good jobs, they buy things and the rest of the economy benefits. So we're much more manufacturing based than the rest of the country. All of that is true. We're like 14% of employment in manufacturing and the country is only at 8%. So, and that's a dramatic difference, and it's been a transformation from non-durable manufacturing, like food, to durable manufacturing, like cars and machinery. So it's been a huge transformation in a short period of time. And the last couple of years, manufacturing is kind of flat in terms of employment because, manufacturers are constantly trying to become more efficient, right? So they're trying to not increase employment, they're trying to increase output. So, but it is the real strength of the economy. And if I had a fear, it's that, manufacturing takes a hit if things go south. And maybe kind of the new manufacturing can resist that, but we'll see. Hopefully no bad things will happen.
Mayor Kelly?
Well, let me start by saying how grateful I am for Dr. Wall being here and for UTC for bringing Dr. Wall here. I can't tell you, as somebody who's been an armchair economist here for a lot of years, how frustrating it was not having somebody paying attention to local trends. And I think Dr. Wall would tell you the somewhat unique nature of our metropolitan area and its own sort of economic vagaries. But it has been interesting, as somebody who's been on the Chamber Board a couple times and been in Chattanooga for many decades, to see this transformation in the last 10 years. Let's face it, I mean, that's when VW came and opened up. I mean, that's the supplier base around VW. Shout out to anybody here from that cluster of the economy, because thank you, and thank you to Senator Corker and the Chamber for making that happen, because that was the pivot point. I can remember my first go-round on the Chamber Board. There was a story in the paper one year, sadly, that Chattanooga had the worst longitudinal growth rate of any city within 500 miles of here prior to that. And since that time, not only have we caught up and sort of exceeded national growth rates, but the job growth and wage growth rates in younger cohorts has improved. So, I mean, it's all the things as a mayor that you want to see in a city.
Yeah, and I should point out also, Chattanooga was really sticking out in the South as not riding the growth. I mean, we're between Atlanta and Nashville and Knoxville, who have been successful for a few decades, and it was just not taking hold here. And the last 10 years or so, it's only Nashville that's growing faster. So now we're growing faster than Atlanta and Knoxville.
Fascinating. And talking about growth, let's switch over to wage growth. And let's talk about how wage growth has changed in Chattanooga. And also, let's also consider how has it changed among various demographics and different populations in the community.
Well, so actually, before we go to these questions, it's almost as if I gave you the questions, because I have papers. You should go to my website, CRER at UTC, Google that, and you'll find white papers on the transformation of the economy, and the most recent one is on wages. And it turns out wages is a little more difficult to assess because you have what's called a composition effect, because when the economy is expanding, it's not just that there's a higher demand, it's that there are different people who are entering the workforce. And when you're doing really well, it means people at kind of lower wages are disproportionately entering the labor force. So that kind of suppresses the numbers. The average is not rising as much, even though everybody's individual wages are getting higher. All that said, the last, again, 10, 12 years, the Chattanooga economy wages have outpaced nationally. And the strength has actually been at the lower end, if you look at it. It's the bottom two quintiles are the ones that have seen the highest median growth rates, real median growth rates in wages. And that's happened nationally too, because after the pandemic, there's been a lot of improvement at the lower end and more people are brought in. And it's much stronger in Chattanooga than you would expect, well, than I expected.
Well, I'd rather be lucky than good any day. I can't say that I can take any credit for that, but it is it aligns entirely with what the goals of the One Chattanooga plan are in terms of essentially creating more economic growth. I mean, if every politician has a theory of change, mine is certainly economic, right? Creating a competitive regional economy, but also closing the wage gap between the haves and the have-nots, and specifically the black and white community here, which are really grotesquely large, as I've said many times. And so, I find myself working more and more on workforce development initiatives, upskilling. In Europe, they call it skills development, not workforce development, skills acquisition, actually, and that's really what it is, right? And so we continue to work on that, continue to focus on that, and, it's gratifying to see it because ultimately, again, we're still behind most of our peer cities in that regard, but our cost of living is a bit lower, so net, I think we're a little better off, right?
Close.
You're the economist. I'm the mayor.
You're running. Well, I'll also point out I have another white paper looking at demographic effects of employment increases, and you don't often see it, but it was very, very broad-based. The employment increases since 2012 or so have been very broadly based across ages, races, education levels, and it's really a remarkable thing. And the strength has actually again been at the lower wage end. But then I also looked at it and said, well, what about geographically? Where is it? Because African-American employment really shot up. And it's, well, what about geographically? So it's the city, the rest of Hamilton County, and then the outlying, the other metro counties. And it's really and the mayor knows this as well as anyone, it's in the city is where there's still kind of the weakness of, for African Americans in particular, it's risen, wages and employment have risen, but not as much as other parts of the local economy. And I think it does come down to workforce development and education and training because the demand has been there.
Well, let's switch to the topic of tariffs. And Chattanooga, of course, has a strong manufacturing base, as we've already been discussing. It also has a number of major construction projects going on at this time. What do you see as the impact that tariffs may have on our local economy?
Well, I agree with Dave that you have no idea what's going to happen, and you also have no idea why it would happen, which is the first problem. President Trump says he wants really high tariffs, he's a tariff man, but then threatens tariffs and backs down with getting almost nothing in return. That has nothing to do with trade. And then there's more tariff threats, and then counting VAT taxes as tariffs, which is just idiotic. They are not. They are the opposite. I mean, they're completely non-distortionary. So it's very difficult to predict what will happen, but nothing good. If tariffs were made lower, then there'd be good things. But any of the tariffs made higher I mean, often you say, well, tariffs will protect domestic blah, 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 but that's mostly, it's very, very limited at best, because more than half of imports are for the production of other goods. It's not consumer goods from China that we're importing. We're more often importing raw materials and intermediate products from Canada and Mexico. Canada is by far our biggest trading partner. And tariffs on Canada means the automobile industry, which is really hasn't recognized borders for decades. The domestic auto manufacturer is going to be hit extremely hard, and you know, lumber, so construction be hit very hard. We get most of, or that's our biggest steel source is Canada. And I'll say, you know, I'm sympathetic to trying to do something about China, whatever that might be, but putting tariffs on Canada is not a good way to get at China. I don't know if that's that controversial or not, but.
Mayor Kelly, you have any comments on this one?
You know, what he said.
Right.
I mean, all I can say is, you know, we know what our, I mean, look, Tennessee has a long tradition. We're one of the top states in the union for foreign direct investment. Trade creates wealth. Again, as Dr. Altig said, this is all stuff you would hear on day one, probably, in Economics 101. So, you know, we're living in bizarro land at the moment, but here's hoping cooler heads will prevail and that we get back to some form of rational economic policy that creates growth, because I worry a lot, obviously, about the local economy, and you know, we would be very hard hit if this doesn't work, and there isn't no evidence to indicate that it will. I mean, you know, for those of you that are curious, go back and Google the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. You know, this is just history, and you'll find that did not end well at all.
And also a follow-up, Dave said it'll be unclear on, the obsession is about prices, because the president and some of his other advisors have said that tariffs are paid by foreigners, which is obviously false. So prices of some goods will go up in the United States, and the overall effect on kind of inflation, that's completely beside the point, because inflation is, these will be one-off increases in prices, but it'll be difficult to detect, because whatever the tariffs are rolled out, they'll be of different levels and different goods, so the average price level will be affected, but you won't be able to tell very clearly how much of it is due to tariffs and how much of it is actual inflation. So there's talk, well, the Fed should ignore the tariff effects, which is right, but it's difficult to figure out what they would be. But the bigger cost of tariffs, which are not talked about, is that it distorts decision-making of businesses. You know, they've talked about how consumers and other firms will respond. They'll respond by doing things that are less efficient than they would otherwise do, and doing things that are less efficient means that we're going to be poorer. So the tariffs make us poorer because they make us do inefficient things instead of efficient things. And you know, it's just a misallocation of resources, never mind that prices are higher or lower. It just impoverishes the economy. It does not enrich the economy.
But I do think, you know, again, armchair economist, but you know, that in combination with a potential, to Dr. Altig's point, restriction in the labor supply could spell bad things.
Right. You know, I guess you hear the argument that, well, the tariffs will hurt short term, but long term they'll bring in more, for instance, manufacturing jobs. But Dr. Wall, I'm here, you say that's really not what you would expect.
Right, because it's comparative advantage. You know, you should sit around for the comparative advantage lecture, because it tells you that you should trade to take advantage of differences, and the real advantages of trade is not to export, but to import, right? You export so that you can import, and you know, part of importing goods or exporting goods, whatever the trade balance is that they're investing in the U.S. economy. So there's a net balance on flows in and out of the economy. It's just that it's an artificial distinction between trade and like the financial side, and it's always in balance. And if you restrict trade, trying to get at some deficit that doesn't matter, then you're going to restrict investment, again, impoverishing.
Well, and you know, as a former and still business owner, right? I mean, capital formation in this case takes quite a long time, right? If you're going to go out and invest, hey, tariffs are here, I'm going to go build a steel factory. Really? You're going to get the loan to build? You know, I mean, you can't count on the tariffs being there. through another administration, for better or for worse. You're just not going to have the capital confidence to be able to do that. So it's a little silly to me.
Let's talk about population growth. And sometimes you'll hear concern about infrastructure keeping up with growth in Chattanooga. What does healthy growth look like for our community, and what should we expect for continued population growth in Chattanooga over the next 5 years?
I'll let the mayor take this one first.
Well, it's been super interesting, right? I ran for the first term during COVID, and I kept, bumping into people who had moved here from elsewhere, and there's probably some of those people in this room. And it was the first time I really began to see the somewhat unexpected dividends of our super fast internet service, right? Because if you can work from home, why wouldn't you work from the place with the best quality of life? And I continue to believe that Chattanooga's stock and trade really is, all told, quality of life, right? This balance between, the great outdoors, our really fast internet. We hear this over and over again, access to good enough schools. We still have to do better in the education department, but it is this kind of Goldilocks thing. And so, income, all these really talented people with higher wages. Now, the downside of that, of course, is they drove up the price of housing. And in economics, the ratchet effect's also very real, and so they bid it up, and people who were kind of stuck in lower wage jobs here without the ability to move up the ladder, either to hold those jobs or even get them, hence we need to support the chamber to recruit more higher wage jobs, are struggling. So it's put us in an interesting position, and we've done a lot. You didn't really ask this, but we are working really hard to set the table in affordable housing policy, and we've done a tremendous amount, as much as any city in the country, to create incentives for affordable housing here. But again, I go to a lot of neighborhood association meetings, and it's amazing to me how many people just think, the city builds housing. We reach into the monopoly box and plop the red house down. I mean, it just doesn't work that way, right? We rely on developers to go and do that, and that is starting to happen. There was a great story in the paper this morning about an investment firm from Los Angeles that's building a big affordable housing project here, which we've been working on for quite some time. But I don't see, to your original question, I don't see those demographic trends changing, and I don't want them to change. Again, my hope is that all these talented people are moving into town, and that results in some new business formation and some general, because that's the challenge. We're out of, as Charles Wood would tell you, this is not Dubuque, Iowa. We don't have big, cornfields that we can plop down new million-square-foot factories. We have to pivot to a knowledge-based economy, and so this is a gift, and we need to take advantage of it.
Well, so a year ago I would have had a different view before I had bought a house. Now that I own a house, I'm more of a NIMBY than I was, because it's housing price. Oh, house price is going up. You say that to people, and half of them say that's great, half of them say that's terrible. But the thing coming here from St. Louis, first thing I'd notice is that it's not flat. I'm not sure if the rest of you have picked up on that also, but there's not, development and building houses is not a straightforward thing, because you just can't turn farms into huge developments. You see a lot of houses jammed up against mountains where they wouldn't have been before. So it's a bit of a challenge, and I think there has been some reform in permit reform, which is definitely needed, because there's the strength of Chattanooga to me is in turning the brown space into housing, and there's been an awful lot of it, and you see more and more of it even in the last year.
Right. Well, this is a great segue into the next question. We've talked about more like population growth, but let's talk about business growth. And of course, our market has been strong in attracting manufacturing and logistics companies. Are we seeing trends of other industries, or are there other strong growth potential in this region?
Well, I'd say it's so manufacturing, the firms are still coming, and I still get surprised at like there was $1 billion investment. I think, oh, that must be like 10,000 jobs or something, but it's 500, which is great. But you get this investment, and that will generate some jobs, but it's really the rest of the economy that goes along with that, which is where the big source of employment is going to come. The core might be in manufacturing, but that's 85%, or not, the rest is 85% of employment. and that's where an awful lot of the growth has to come from. And there's some interesting things. The privatization of the hospitals was, becoming the private sector instead of public sector. I think health employment was kind of low, and the health sector was not as strong as I would have expected. But privatizing a major player like that might bring that into the future of healthcare employment, and as an industry in Chattanooga be stronger. So that would be one I'd be kind of looking at.
Mayor Kelly?
Well, again, Howard would certainly know better than I, but again, there's been some efforts and discussion around that healthcare sector, and I do think Erlanger's pivot will help, and I know there's a great deal of interest there. I think we're actually, don't know if we've announced it, but some interesting companies that are relocating here in that regard, so that's promising. I will say, in sort of an adjacent sector, or topic, a lot of this gets back to the university's research assets. And somewhat controversially, which is mysterious to me, I have said publicly, and will continue to say, UTC needs more R&D assets. And of course, we're working very hard on quantum technology and on advanced mobility topics with Mina Sartipi and her team at the Center for Urban Informatics and Progress. And I was just in DC with her the other day with the global meeting of the 5GAA Association, and believe it or not, Chattanooga is one of the global leaders in research in this V2X, vehicle-to-vehicle communication, and we've got this incredible density of LiDAR and smart switches. The research that's going on here is great. So there's tremendous, potential in that, but we have to be able to resource the university correctly, because that correlates very closely to business formation and recruitment, and as Charles Wood would tell you.
Well, I'll just favor enormous amounts of resources going into universities.
Especially in the economics department.
Yeah.
Yes. Great. Do either of you have any final thoughts, Dr. Wall?
Well, it's, I told Dave this, I'm gonna retire this joke, and it's been a year where whenever I've given a talk in Chattanooga, it's been not difficult, but a challenge sometimes to get used to all of the lines going up instead of all the lines going down after 25 years in St. Louis. And I think I've come to that, so I'm going to start seeing some bad things. So look forward to some negative things coming out of it.
Boo. No, I mean, again, we're in a weird spot. I really appreciated Dr. Altig's presentation, but he doesn't know. I certainly don't know. All we have to say is, I mean, I feel like our economy is fairly well diversified, and we'll kind of weather this for a little while. And again, if Tennessee has got a long history of being a very pro-business state and Republican leadership, gosh, at least time was, we're really smart when it came to this sort of thing. So, hopefully, we get back on track. I will say, and I would remind everyone here, roughly 90% of gross domestic product in this country is produced in cities. Okay? I mean, despite all the rhetoric and everything else, anything that collectively freaks out cities or disrupts cities is not likely to be good for economic growth. I'll leave you with that.
Well, so I would say that, in terms of policy, so local policy is fine. There's always things to do to improve things. State policy is fine. It's a pretty good environment. And overall, if we get something really bad happening to Chattanooga, it's because something's happening nationally. So if you have any fears, it's keeping an eye on things nationally. Locally, we always things to improve on and keep working at that, but only the bad news will only come nationally.
Well, great. Thank you very much for sharing your insights. It was very interesting and entertaining. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I hope, I know we've got folks leaving. I do hope that this is a little different from last year, and hope kind of the local view of this was really helpful. Once again, I would love to thank Mayor Kelly, Dr. Howard Wall from UTC, and certainly Rusty Gray for the panel, and then also David Altig from the Atlanta Fed for coming up here every year and kind of helping us with this event and really kind of sharing his view on where things are headed with the economy. Again, want to thank our two presenting sponsors, Chattanooga Gas and Bank of America. Thank you so much for supporting this event, and certainly appreciate that. Our next event is June 11th, which is our Diversify event. And then last thing I will note is nominations are open for Leadership Chattanooga. Leadership Chattanooga is in its 40th year or 41st year. Both are current mayors, both Mayor Wamp and Mayor Kelly are graduates of that program. And so it has been a huge part of us building a thriving Chattanooga. You can't build a thriving Chattanooga without great leaders. And so thank you for being here. Please nominate someone for Leadership Chattanooga, and I appreciate everybody being here this morning.